Well, thanks everyone for joining. This is our first Effective Altruism Lausanne talk. And for today we have Juan García Martínez. And so to give you a little background, Juan obtained his Master of Science in Chemical Engineering from the University of Twente and went on to join ALLFED, so the Alliance to Feed the Earth in Disasters, as a research associate. He has a background on carbon dioxide capture and utilization with his master thesis and his internship at the Energy Research Center of the Netherlands. His work at ALLFED focuses on assessing the potential of various technologies for production of food resilient to global catastrophes, including fermentation technology in general, single-cell proteins from CO2 or natural gas, sugars from plant fiber or CO2, fats from microorganisms or hydrocarbons, vinegar via microbial electrosynthesis, and glycerin as food from CO2 or hydrocarbons. So I will now leave the floor to Juan.
Thanks for the intro, Alex. So I'm Juan, the research coordinator at ALLFED, the Alliance to Feed the Earth in Disasters, as you well said. And today I'm going to be giving you a short introduction to who we are, what we do, and why. And after that, there will be a Q&A, which I expect the presentation will take about 10 or 15 minutes, and then the rest of the time will be for answering your questions. So in order to do that, Alex has prepared a Slido thingy for you to be able to submit your questions while we are doing the presentation. So it would be great if you could come up with lots of them. Right, so thanks. And let's start with who are ALLFED. I thought it would make sense to start with the board of advisors. And I've made a selection of 6 people from the board. There are many more experts on the board. You can check our website and see them all. There's people from Cambridge, Oxford, Stanford University, University College London, and people from other EA-aligned organizations such as the Future of Humanity Institute, Future of Life Institute, and so on. Of course, the Center for the Study of Existential Risk. We have them in our board, and they are helping us guide our strategic research decisions and making sure we make research that's in fact impactful, and we're very grateful to them for that. Now, the people who make up the ALLFED team. We are currently about 15 people or so, including part-time and full-time people on the ALLFED team. We have grown a lot in the last couple of years, and we are very grateful for that. We have experts doing lots of different types of disciplines. We have engineers, economists, people working on policy, and so on, from very diverse backgrounds. And of course, we have at any given time, about 15 volunteers or so. People go in and out, but at any given point, there's usually about 15 people doing volunteering for us active. And there's also our interns, which during the summer, we normally get a few as well. So that's who we are. Now, next question is, what do we do? So what I'm showing here is our motto at ALLFED, which is feeding everyone no matter what. We are trying to ensure that people have food even in the worst catastrophes imaginable or likely. And our mission, I would state as, our mission is to enable humanity or society as a whole to recover from extreme food catastrophes. So again, what are these global catastrophes I'm talking about? This is a diagram that describes the different global catastrophes we deal with, as well as the ones that are related, but that we don't deal with as much. And from left to right, you can see the slide increasing in severity of the catastrophe. And it's a very long list of catastrophes of very varied types and with very different properties. Let me just say, so out of there's, slow regular climate change, as you know, is very related to food security. And as it progresses, it is able to reduce yields of some crops. So that affects food security all around the world, particularly in the most vulnerable countries. And that gets into food shocks within single digits, so to speak, of the total amount of food production or global food production that we have on Earth. So, there's within the normal variability of food production shifts of a plus minus 1%, 2%, 3% of the global food production. And that sounds like not much, but it can create important food spikes and exacerbate food insecurity. That's why it's important to address climate change, among other things. And then there are other disasters, localized disasters, such as, there's a hurricane in here, but there are many other things that can affect food security. And that's within our sphere of influence, but it's not our main focus at all. Now, when we start nearing the double digits within the total loss of global food production, that's where our focus starts to be. There are many different disasters that have been identified in scientific literature that could cause this to happen. And this would be catastrophic for global food security everywhere at a given time at the current level of preparedness. So just to name a few, there's volcanic eruptions as have happened in the past, concurrent extreme weather events leading to a multiple breadbasket failure, super weeds, super diseases, super pests would be, and if any of these were to happen concurrently, it would make things even worse. There's also the possibility of an abrupt climate change, just because the Earth system is somewhat unstable, and it has happened in the past. In the records, there are spikes and wells that change that would change agricultural yields significantly and relatively abruptly. So that's also a problem. Then we have a different type of catastrophe that affects crop yields somewhat differently. So there's what I call the loss of industrial civilization or an industrial collapse, which can take place through many different mechanisms. There's been extreme solar storms in the past that could happen again. There could be coordinated cyber attacks by hacker groups or nation states warring on each other, or an aero AI device for this for this purpose. There's also the possibility of a coordinated high altitude EMP attack or nuclear EMP, where the EMP would basically fry electronic circuits and cause an entire region or multiple, if it's coordinated, to fall into basically pre-industrial conditions. So that would be quite bad for agricultural yields. You'd lose probably about half of the agricultural production if that were to happen. And then we jump into the three main, very large catastrophes that would approach a global food production nearing total loss. So nearly 100%, between 80 to 100% in the worst cases. And these are what I call the abrupt sunlight reduction scenarios, in which there's these three mechanisms, and there's probably other things that have not been identified in literature, but that could also cause global agriculture to collapse. So these three abrupt sunlight reduction scenarios, namely impact, an asteroid or comet impact, an extreme volcano eruption, or a global nuclear war causing a nuclear winter. The mechanism is similar. You get a lot of aerosols, sulfates, soot that gets lodged into the atmosphere, and that causes a lot of the sunlight that normally reaches the surface of the Earth to not get there, which causes crops to fail significantly. And those are the ones where we have that's the reason why ALLFED started, because this is a thing and there's not much being against it. And that's where we've been mostly focusing on, among the other things I've mentioned previously. And then on the highest end of the scale, there's existential risks, where there is a loss of, direct human extinction, or a significant loss of the long-term potential of humanity. So maybe we get locked in a terrible future or something like that, via a takeover of a misaligned artificial intelligence, or an extreme pandemic where we can't recover. And so this is not something we directly work in. We don't really do research on AI or anything like that. But we do work on existential risk indirectly, in a way, by trying to reduce what is called existential risk factors, which are things that make it more likely that a catastrophe becomes existential. To give you an example, I would consider a very bad response to a nuclear war, where a lot of people starve, an existential risk factor, because it could cause very bad governance to get locked in, or many other things that could go wrong. So that's the global vision of the type of catastrophes we deal with at ALLFED. Then what do we really do about these catastrophes? What we do is work on solutions to these. Rather than just studying this, we are actually looking at what can be done to respond and recover from this. So to give the example of the abrupt sunlight reduction scenario I was giving before, with these 3 big catastrophes I've mentioned, that would cause temperatures to fall, rainfall to decrease significantly. The sunlight that plants need to grow would also be lost significantly. So this would cause widespread global catastrophic crop failures. So what could we do? And that would reduce the level of production, of food production, to significantly less than we need to feed everyone. I mean, right now we are producing enough to feed everyone in the world 2 or 3 times or more, and this would reduce it to less than 1. So that's quite problematic, as you can imagine. So what are our options to respond to this? Well, we could use industrial, what I call the industrial resilient food solutions, such as the ones that ALLFED has mentioned during my introduction. There's single cell protein from CO2 or methane. You can convert plant fiber into sugars, or extract proteins from the leafy biomass. Then apart from the industrial solutions, we have many other things. We have seaweed, which scales really fast. You could ramp up seaweed production around the world as caloric and protein supplementation. There are some crops that you would likely, even in the worst scenarios, still be able to cultivate to some degree. Potatoes are one, as shown here, but there are quite a few others. There's canola oil. Then there's greenhouse crops. You could scale up greenhouse production to, make use of whatever little sunlight you have left as best as you can. And as well, you can relocate these cool tolerant crops to areas where now the new climate after the catastrophe is better for them to grow. You will need to relocate a lot of seeds and so on. And finally, there's of course the use of food stocks. There's lots of wheat stocks that are available at any time. And there's also livestock that you can use. So that will be a key part of an effective response, stock management as well. So these are the type of solutions that we globally study. These are just some of them. There are other type of solutions that are not captured here, such as policy and regulatory solutions, but it gives you a taste of the type of solutions that we are proposing and have been researching. So briefly, we do research. We do academic research on global catastrophic risks, the way a think tank or an university department does, in a way. We do research on what I call global catastrophic food shocks, which basically refers to food shocks, the loss of food production in this case, around the world that could qualify, that will be so severe to qualify as global catastrophic risks. And the abrupt sunlight reduction scenarios I've mentioned before, as well as the collapse of electricity or industry that I've also mentioned. And our type of research is quite interdisciplinary. Generally, we focus on research to increase preparedness and resilience of institutions and countries and regions around the world. And the type of research we do has to do with scenario analysis and integrated assessment of the way an effective response would look like to one of these catastrophes, as well as research on engineering and food technologies regarding the characteristics that make these foods resilient to different catastrophes, and how we could leverage industrial resources and these type of things in order to have an effective and adequate response to extreme catastrophes related to food. Then, of course, we also do research on agricultural systems and in food security. I mean, all of our research can be categorized to a degree as food security research. It's not the usual research you'd find in food security, in the food security literature, but in a way it is food security and food safety. And then, of course, we also have research in economics, business, and finance, as that is a key part of when, like, you cannot have an effective response without having your economic considerations ironed out and your financial systems ready to cope with such extreme risks. So that's also something we do a lot of research on. And finally, policy research and outreach to key stakeholders in order to start making it easier for institutions and decision makers to think about these things, think about the fact that this is a risk that ought to be addressed and how we could do it effectively. We also do research on many other topics such as nutrition, for example, because you need nutritious food to survive no matter the situation, right? So, and this on the right is the book that started it all, called Feeding Everyone No Matter What, written by David Denkenberger, which is the director of research and co-founder of ALLFED, if you're curious. And that is everything I had to say about what ALLFED does. Now I'm going to why are we doing this? So naturally, the best outcome for everyone, I mean, that's pretty clear, would be for none of this to happen ever, right? So a lot of work is being devoted to prevention of some of these catastrophes. So as you probably know, there's a lot of good work being done on prevention of nuclear war by lots of organizations and people. But there's not nearly enough as much work being done on what if it happens, right? Are we prepared for it if it were to happen? At any time, there is what I call the background probability of nuclear war in case systems fail. You know, we've had a few close calls over the year, or due to heightened geopolitical tensions, people might get overexcited, or there could be a failure of communication, and then we do get a catastrophe. In this case, nuclear winter. But then there's also the other ones that do not rely as much on what humans do, such as the supervolcanic eruptions or the asteroid impact. So it seems like generally it is a good idea to be prepared no matter what the probability for these things is. So what we focus on is what happens after the catastrophe has not been prevented. And what I'm showing here on the screen is the so-called three broad defense layers model, which states it's a way to imagine the mechanism for a catastrophe to become existential, but it's applicable to these global catastrophic risks. So once the negative scenario has scaled into a global catastrophe, it has not been prevented, then you can have an adequate response to it, such that you're able to respond. In this case, would be, you know, scaling food production, using different systems, starting if you could, you know, create international or regional mechanisms to respond and have them activate if something like this happens. So there are ways you can respond to it. It's not the end of the world as soon as it happens. It's very important. And even if we do not manage to respond to it adequately, there's the possibility that it does not become existential in the way that it doesn't get everyone. So not everyone is killed. And then of the people who survive, the conditions are good enough for them to recover civilization and basically not lose the future potential of humanity. So that's, in a way, what we're focusing on: response and resilience to global food catastrophes and global catastrophes in general, because it's more neglected than prevention generally. And just for completion, the two W's I was missing: where and when does ALLFED work? Well, we work all around the globe. We are an international team, and we have people, I think, now on 4 continents and many different countries, which also means that at any given time, there's people working on ALLFED stuff at some point in the world at a different time zone. So in a way, we're working 24 hours a day, just for completeness. And that's the end of the introduction I wanted to give you. And now I'd like to jump into the Q&A session. So let's see which questions you've come up with. I've also have some ideas here in case you run out of ideas.
Okay, I can maybe start with one question. So what do you think is needed to bring this research to the next level? What is missing?
Well, good question. What is the next level, right? So the next level of the research is, I guess, making it more precise, researching more different solutions, getting more people looking into the problem from different angles, from more angles, and we're looking at it right now when more resources are available. So like any other, in a way, scientific disciplines and future studies, the more resources it has, the more angles it can take, the more solutions we could research. So that's one way to answer. The other way to answer would be, how do we make sure that this research is applicable and it actually reaches, turns into real preparedness in the real world? So that's kind of a harder question. We're working on it as well. What is needed with it is alliances with institutions, governments, companies, other key stakeholders, industrial partners. That's something we're working on it as well. And something I would love to see, but we're very far from that still, is international preparedness plans to respond to these catastrophes. So if our research were to help inform those and help people start thinking about this and participate in the creation of that, I would consider a huge success.
Okay, thanks. We have another question, which is there a good example of a large-scale food crisis response that we can learn from? And how does that compare to the magnitude of risks that you study?
Fantastic question. So there are some historical precedents for these catastrophes. The thing is, none of them has happened in the last 200 years or so. So modern industrial society has never seen anything near the scale of what we're talking about yet. What that means is it's hard to say how good the historical precedents are, but there are definitely things we can learn from them, even if society and humanity was very different back then. So there's the precedent of in the 18th century, there was or maybe 19th century, I'm maybe getting it wrong, there was the Indonesian volcano that caused widespread crop failures around Europe, which is one of the reasons why we know of this effect and why it has been researched. And there are some things we have actually learned from that, such as the way, regarding the behavior of people in that situation, the way they proceeded. They reduced meat intake. They very quickly tried to get rid of animals because, well, suddenly you don't have what to feed them with. You'd rather eat it yourself. So that's something interesting we've learned. So there's things to be learned about historical precedents. Okay.
Another one is there a risk that by making the impact of nuclear war easier to tolerate, we increase the likelihood that countries might try to initiate such a war?
Great question.
Is this research bad?
Yes, that's one I always like, the moral hazard question. So there's a good case. I mean, a lot of smart people have asked this question, and we've pondered it quite a lot from the start. I mean, we've been thinking about this for years. We don't really think that there's much of a chance of that being the case, because generally say nuclear war is a very extremely terrible thing, no matter how prepared you are to respond. It's not going to be fun for anyone, even if we have the best response possible, even if we dedicate everything we can. So for example, the countries that have, or the regions that have started the war are just most likely going to be completely devastated. So we're normally, in the case of nuclear winter, we're talking about saving everyone else in a way. You know, a lot of people over there would still survive, but I don't think their institutions would survive. So it's not in their self-interest. I don't think that's what they're thinking about. They're not really thinking about the aftermath when it happens, because it will be terrible for them, no matter how prepared they are to respond. So it doesn't seem to us that the moral hazard case stands, but you know, it is a really interesting thing to think about.
Okay, super interesting. Another one is, roughly how long do current food storage last? How fast do the new food system need to be able to start feeding people? Like, is it in days? Is it in weeks? Is it in months?
Yes, so there's a lot of questions around this, but in short, the answer is months. And we have been estimating this and refining our estimates over the years. In a way, the answer depends on when does the catastrophe strike, because agricultural stocks are cyclical and they change over the harvesting seasons. So, but at any given point, there are probably between, and it also depends a lot in the country, but globally, let's say if we want to feed everyone in the world and talk about all the feedstocks, or all the food stocks that we have, we probably would have enough to feed everyone for 1 to 6 months or so. And depending on the harvest cycle time. And it varies a lot within countries. So some countries are a lot more prepared, you know, have 6 to 12 months storage. Others have more of a just-in-time agricultural system where they don't even have a month of food storage. It also depends on how much livestock you have, because that's also a food stock. But yeah, that's kind of, let's say, between 1 to 12 months, depending on where you live, is a reasonable answer.
Okay, so we have 6 months to figure out how to feed everyone else, right?
Pretty much.
So regarding implementation and deployment, how do you grow confidence that you got a good enough system?
A good enough system. So yeah, some of the foods we're talking about have already been used for a very long time. So yeah, it's going to take me quite a while to answer the question. So think about seaweed, for example. It's being used for millennia in some Eastern European countries, East Asian countries, and even some European countries as well. And the systems are relatively simple to apply and to scale. So in a way, we know it works, which is not the case for some of the other foods. You know, there's the more high-tech stuff, such as the single-cell protein from CO2, you know, you get taking CO2 and hydrogen converting into bacteria. That's, you know, still being developed, still being scaled. So it's kind of a different situation for some of the foods, but for the ones that a lot of them are already very established. So in a way, the systems are technically usable. So in that way, they are good for that. Now the question also leads into, how do we know the techniques we have are good enough to scale them as quickly as is needed to yield an effective response? And that is a separate question. So again, seaweed, we know people have increased seaweed production relatively fast in China, Japan, and so on. May not be the case around the world, but if the knowledge seems to be there in terms of the fast scaling. That's not necessarily the case for other foods, which may respond better or worse depending on the catastrophes. And that's why it's important to have a portfolio in case some of them don't work. You still have a few others that would still work. So in a way, something we're also doing research on is, again, for the single cell protein example, because requires factories, requires industry, and so on. For that one, there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of, how do we increase the production of this quickly? How do we scale our qualified labor capabilities, operators for the machines, engineers, and so on? How do we make sure we can produce all the steel units in order to cultivate, ferment the CO2, get the cells, and build it quickly? So the answer to the question depends on which food you're looking at. And the important thing, in a way, is that the whole portfolio of resilient foods, 5, 10, 20, whichever ones, is good overall, so that we have a lot of different options to choose from, and we can, start scaling them. Some of them, depending on how the situation is when catastrophe strikes, because it may be very different from today, and where you are in the world, and so on. Some of those, at least, should be workable. And that's why it's really important that it's the portfolio that's good, not just a single given food, but you can answer the question differently for each of the foods.
Super interesting. The next one is, what is your favorite resilient feeding solution that has the potential to be usable in most of the world locations?
Right. So my favorite food solution in general is single cell protein. I can't hide it. I've written multiple papers on it. I think it's a really elegant solution. And it's also...
Can you explain maybe quickly how it works?
Right. So single cell protein, I'm talking about microbial protein. Basically, you take some feedstock. You can make it from sugars, from CO2, from methane, from plant fiber, from bio-waste, agricultural residues. Basically, you take something, you feed it to a culture of bacteria, fungi, microalgae, something like that, and then you grow it on that substrate, and you produce a lot of very high quality protein in some kind of there are many different formats for it, but you can make it a powder, you can make a meat substitute, you can make many different things with it. And that's one thing that I really like about it. Doing research on this food is also related to solving other global problems, such as animal farming, because you can use it for meat substitutes. It's really good protein and relatively cheap, high quality. Now to answer so that's my favorite solution, and the ones you would use specifically for responding to an extreme global food catastrophe, or such as an abrupt sunlight reduction scenario, would be the ones focused on feedstocks resilient to sunlight reduction, such as the plant fiber that will be lying around, or the CO2 from the atmosphere, or the methane from the methane wells. Not all the types of single cell protein will be useful, but many of them will be. Now, to answer, I think that one is the situation. That technology is applicable to industrialized countries, or countries that are able to build a lot of factories on this. Now, out of all the food solutions that are really global, that don't really require a lot of infrastructure to produce, which one's my favorite? I would say the seaweed, because as long as you have some amount of coast near your country, lots of countries, and a lot of the global population is living around the coast, right? So by producing a lot of seaweed, which is relatively simple to produce, you can feed a lot of people. I mean, it scales really, really fast. It goes like 5 to 20 or 30% growth rate per day, which is insane. And it would still be able to grow significantly even if in the low quality condition, low sunlight conditions, because I mean, they grow below the ocean, right? So it's their thing. So out of the ones, I think this is the one that seems like it's got a lot going for it. You know, it grows fast, it grows where a lot of people need it. It's relatively low cost and it's simple. So those are my two favorites.
Okay. Diego?
I don't know if you can hear me, but
I can hear you.
all right. So I had one question regarding what you said. What is blocking us from using the single cell proteins today? Because it seems like it's something that we could use even without the need of a catastrophe to enable that.
Do you want me to repeat, or is it fine?
No, I heard all right. Yeah, I'll answer. So there is not that much that's blocking us from applying these technologies today. So let me preface my answer by saying that this year, or maybe starting early next year, the first full-scale single-cell protein production from methane is going to start operating at about 80,000 tons per year, which is a full-fledged industrial large-scale production operation. So in a way, we're already starting to use it. That one's for fish feed, but it could just as well, be repurposed for human food production. And there are a lot of startups that are interested in converting CO2 to protein today around the world. They're a little bit behind, a little less developed than the example I just gave, but it's being developed and they're getting lots of funding. So I think there's a chance it will catch on and will be used as a food ingredient and maybe as the basis for meat substitutes. So in a way, it's already starting to happen. And then another important part to the answer is you might have already had nutritional yeast at some point in your life. You may have already eaten it. And that's technically single-cell protein. They make it from sugar, so it wouldn't be very useful in a catastrophe event. But we've been producing it for many, many decades, and it's not an uncommon food ingredient. So in a way, we are already using it, and it's already scaling up.
Thanks.
Another question is, do these solutions assume the sun is blocked forever or more temporary? If so, how many crops or foods currently exist that can live in such conditions?
Right. So, interesting question. First, there's no mechanism, as far as I'm aware, that I have heard of for the sun to be blocked for a very, very long amount of time. The longest, most extreme nuclear winter simulation I've ever seen was something like 15 years, which is a lot, but it's not 100 years or forever. So I don't think that's something I've considered. And another thing is, when in these abrupt sunlight reduction scenarios, what happens is, it's not that the sun gets blocked, which is in a way why I moved away from using the term sun blocking, but it's that half of the sunlight that normally reaches the Earth's surface becomes reflected instead, and we don't get it. But we're still getting some of it, and that's why even in the worst scenarios, we will still be able to, relocate cool-tolerant crops to higher sunlight areas, use greenhouses to better utilize the sunlight we get. So I guess the answer is I don't think we're really looking into that. But to go even further, there are there are clearly no crops that will survive without sunlight, with no sunlight at all. There are some crops that would adapt to a forever catastrophe that reduces half of sunlight forever. you would still be able to grow, you know, potatoes, canola, and maybe a couple other sugar beets, I don't know. In the tropics, probably, which is where you get a lot more sunlight. So most plants would die, but a lot of them would stay around. I mean, not all plants died during the dinosaur extinction, you know, the asteroid. A lot of plants survive from there, and they are the ancestors or the flora we have today. So in a way, there are some plants that will survive, and some of the crops, staple crops we use today, would still be around.
A related question to this one is, what role could artificial light play in this kind of scenario?
Right, artificial light is an interesting one. So the thing with artificial light is it could have a role, definitely, but you wouldn't be able to use it to feed much people, or many people rather, because it's, for one, extremely expensive. So the cost of energy per calorie produced is super high. And actually, David, my boss, estimated that artificial light, even if you were to use all of the energy that we have today in the world for production of food via artificial light, you'd feed at most about 5% of the global population. So you can only go so far with artificial light without significantly scaling the use of electricity. And the food will be extremely expensive, so only the richest people will be able to afford it, which is also a very important part of the, you know, the economic considerations. Now, that said, there's still a way, there's still a role for artificial light to play, even in an economically feasible response. We have been looking at using it strategically in greenhouses to supplement some light for some plants to be able to flower and do their normal cycle, but just, you know, during a short amount of time and only for some crops that need it. So there is a role for artificial light to be to be had, but it's not really a very key part of the response, of an effective response.
Yeah.
It is more a question and a comment on the last question. So, for example, we can imagine scenarios where we have, for example, big volcano eruptions that where the problem is not really the volcano eruption, but like because the sun will be blocked for some time, then this might, for example, lead to a glass age. And like in general, when we have this like sudden transformation of the climate, this is a very big problem for like the population, for the size of the population that we have now. Do you think that we can still survive the transition to a sudden, somehow sudden like glass age? Is it possible, like given the number population size?
That's a super interesting question. So let's talk about the aftermath of the nuclear winter then. Let's assume we have had a nuclear winter and we have had an effective response to it. People have survived by eating these resilient food solutions or resilient foods. And then what happens when it's done? So actually, because that's your question, right?
Not exactly. So maybe like, the point is that maybe it is that there is some catastrophe, but the catastrophe will lead to a permanent like change in the climate, for example, like a glass age, which will last like at least like, based on the last glass ages, 20,000 years.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. So I'll answer your question, but what I've been seeing around, this is not the part I'm really studying, but what I've seen is that after, say, a nuclear, volcanic, or whatever winter sunlight reduction scenario, what people are more concerned about is for the opposite to happen. There will be a, not an ice age, but rather like a super global warming after that, which brings different problems. But what will happen after the aftermath of the catastrophe, it kind of depends on the time that the catastrophe strikes, which type of a catastrophe it is, and so on. But I guess I've never heard of an ice age after the nuclear winter, but I guess it's possible. Yeah.
There are some very big volcanoes that they erupted it will be very catastrophic. For the smaller ones, the smaller ones in general, they changed just the climate for just a little bit of time, in general for months or so. So it is not a very big problem, but there are some, I don't remember the name, but there is a very huge volcano. It's erupted, I think, the end.
Yeah. Now that you mentioned, I do recall having read something about volcanic eruptions triggering ice ages. Okay. All right, but I'll answer your question more broadly. So what happened? What if the catastrophe triggers a long-term change? My answer would be we'd still be able to adapt. Obviously, that depends on how large the change is, but I don't really see a reason why we wouldn't technically be able to adapt to it. Even, the entire global population, I think there's a case to be made that could be fed through that event. So I'm going to talk about the food because it's the part that I know about. I'm not sure what else that would entail. I guess that's a question for someone else, but let's talk about the food. So I do believe there's a reason to think that whichever long-term change one of these catastrophes triggers, we'd still be able to survive through it. At least we wouldn't die because of the food. So even out of all these resilient food solutions, there are some that are useful, that you can still produce even in an ice age, even if, a lot of crops would still be able to be grown somewhere around the world. The change wouldn't necessarily be as bad everywhere. So there are still some places where people will be able to grow food, grow these cold tolerant crops, and produce other things. Some of these foods, such as the industrial solutions, are entirely independent of climate, which is an interesting way to think about it. So what I call closed environment food production systems, such as the single cell protein or converting biomass to sugars or spirulina and things like that. All of those are independent of climate, independent of food export bans. If you have the factory, you can just produce food, and independent of many other things. As long as you have a functioning industry, you can still produce them, even in an ice age or even in a very severe global warming and temperature rise scenario. So there are ways you can adapt to it. It's a little bit an answer in the same vein of how do we survive a nuclear winter? How do we survive an ice age? How do we survive a long-term temperature rise? There are ways we can adapt. It's hard to make the case, that the population would stay as large as it is right now, because it's possible people would move around. I'm not sure how that would affect, but I don't see a reason why that would be unadaptable, as long as you have an adequate response to the catastrophe that allows you to adapt to the long term, because in order to adapt to the aftermath of the catastrophe, you first have to have adapted to the catastrophe itself. And it's the part at the beginning that matters most. If you adapt at the worst time, when the first harvest failed, if you already have solutions starting then you already have a functioning food system. And if your functioning food system then goes through an ice age or a temperature rise, you have more time to adapt than you have had to adapt to the catastrophe itself. So if you've been able to adapt to the catastrophe, it stands to reason that you would likely also be able to adapt to the longer term climate change. So that's what I think. Have I answered the question?
Well, I think, like, from what I understand, like, if you mean by like just survive and just that the human race will continue living, I think, yeah, you said we can survive, but like it was more like a question about like can we all survive? And I don't think so. That we can. Like, I think it
I'd
will
be
be
so
just
sure.
very severe, and some people will have to die.
Could you repeat the question, Alex? It was a little low, the volume.
He was saying like the question was less about if we will survive like as humanity, but if everyone will survive, like is that possible?
Oh,
That's
well,
right?
Right.
Unlikely.
That's a different question. Yes, it's unlikely. It's technically feasible, but it's especially given current response capabilities, it's very unlikely. And it depends again on the nature of the catastrophe happening. So if we're talking, say, a nuclear war, it's clear that not everyone would survive because the countries that have been targeted would lose a significant amount of the population. If we're talking about a supervolcanic eruption, well, some people would die in the volcano, right? But most of the effect would be in the global collapse. And of course, given how food systems work today, it's very unlikely because that everyone survives. But because, as you know, we have people dying of hunger today, sadly, very unfortunately, even though we produce way more than enough food to feed everyone on Earth. And the reasons for that are multiple. There are economic reasons. There are reasons related to conflict. Most famines today are due to conflict. So that's also something to consider. Some reasons why not everyone would likely survive. But if we were to change food systems, if we were to make preparedness plans, effective response in place, actually make real preparedness happen, to be prepared even for something like this, and should the worst were to happen, we make it happen. So we make an effective response happen, then it stands to reason that actually everyone that has not been killed directly in the catastrophe could survive. So the answer is unlikely that everyone would survive now, yes, no matter what happens, because there's people already dying because of conflict and other things. But if we do change the way we do things, and if we do prepare, I don't see why pretty much everyone, almost everyone, would be able to survive.
Okay, okay, yeah.
It's another question, so I don't know if you're finished with that.
Oh, there are 3 more on the slide, though, if that's fine.
You can also make comments if you like. This can be a conversation.
Yeah, should I go? Okay. It was regarding the COVID or the response to the COVID crisis, where we saw that all rich countries secured first, second, and third dose for their own population first. So I was just wondering how big of a problem you envision it would be to make all countries cooperate in securing the food stocks around the world in this scenario.
I don't think I got that entirely. So is the question about COVID or about international cooperation, or both?
Just after seeing the response of the countries with the COVID vaccinations, I was wondering how big of a problem you think it will be to make all countries cooperate in limiting their meat consumption and providing food for everyone.
I can add maybe to this because it's also related to one of the questions, and you correct me if that's not related. How do you ensure that collaboration prevails over selfishness after a catastrophe? Is that related? Yeah.
Yes.
Good. Right, yeah. That is the million-dollar question, right? For an effective response to happen, it seems very necessary to have international cooperation in place, or at least within regions. Cooperation is super important to making a lot of these solutions happen. So that's a key part of responding, as with many other global catastrophic risks. So it's strongly dependent on the situation of the world should a catastrophe strike. Now, I'm not an expert on international relations, so I have a hard time answering this question, but that is something we're also doing research on. Our research so far has proven that international cooperation in current, like should something like this happen today, international cooperation would be a key part of the solution. And it stands to reason that it would be no matter what. Now, that's if you want to feed everyone, of course. There are things and solutions that can be applied even if international cooperation breaks down. So if you're a country that, say, a developed country that maybe like gets a widespread crop failure, but then you still have your industry intact, you can leverage your industry to produce food via, single-cell protein or others of the industrial foods. So there are some food responses, even in the worst cases, that do not really require international cooperation. And same for, say you're a country in the tropics that wouldn't get as affected as others, then you'd still be able to grow some crops. Then you get into the problem that probably the seeds you need are held by your neighbors. So you'd have to somehow get it from them. But there are ways you can do, even should cooperation break down. But cooperation is a very, very important part. And it's something that I really hope we get if something like this happens, some degree of international or global even cooperation. We have seen, for example, in response to COVID, I don't know as much about the vaccines, but regarding the food impacts of COVID. So at the start, it looked like it could be terrible. Even though, a pandemic, we don't really think about a pandemic when we're thinking about things that affect the food system, but it does. It can, rather. And the way we respond to a negative event is what determines whether it is a catastrophe, it turns into a catastrophe or not. And thankfully, with COVID, with the pandemic, it didn't turn into a food catastrophe. Why was that? Because of international cooperation. So at the start, some countries started implementing food bans, which is the literal worst thing you can have happening at the start of a catastrophe in terms of food systems. Russia started, most famously Russia, cut out their imports, and some countries which are entirely dependent on them were in severe trouble. But thanks to the intervention of supranational organizations and international alliances, they were all saying, no matter what happens, we are not going to stop trade, we're going to keep trade flowing and so on. And that kept cooperation going. And then the worst impact did not materialize. Russia revoked and others revoked their trade bans. And everyone was able to, well, not everyone, unfortunately, there's always someone dying of hunger, but most people were able to get through it unscathed, and it didn't turn into a food systems crisis. The worst effects came after because of the economic effects of COVID and so on, but it didn't turn into a catastrophe. So I guess that's a learning we can take from the COVID crisis. could have been much worse, but it wasn't because of international cooperation. So maybe that's a positive light on this.
I have a comment on this. Cooperation in general, we think of it as a good thing, but like if we replace the word cooperation with just like connection, and like because like we can also see COVID as the first like signal that we are in a world that is very, very connected, and where a small problem that may start somewhere can spread very fast. And like do you think that we should like reduce connectivity in our world and implicitly also reduce cooperation and like tend to a world where we have entities that are more independent than entities that are dependent on each other? That is a
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. This is an interesting topic to think about. I'm out of my depth in this. I'm not an expert in institutions or anything like that. It's absolutely right that the global interconnectedness brings strengths as well as fragilities on all systems, not only food systems. But and the thing that seems clear is whichever response we need to study or we want to study here will have to be in the current system, because it seems like global connectedness is a thing that's going to continue foreseeably and reliably in the future. And if that changes, then we'll simply adapt our scenario analysis and thinking to the new situation. Now, in terms of what's best for responding to global catastrophes in general, when consequences are global of whatever the catastrophe is, food or not, some regions are going to, if assuming everyone wants to save everyone, some regions are going to have to pull others up. Some regions are going to have some capabilities, maybe seeds. Others are going to have some capabilities, maybe climate. And then for other global catastrophic risks, it could be some key piece of technology or knowledge or military or whatnot. Anyways, it seems like even if an unconnected world, even assuming we don't have the fragilities of an unconnected world, to respond to a global catastrophe, you kind of need a global response. Maybe that's not necessarily the case, but it could be the case. I think that will be the case in most global catastrophes. Again, it could be more solid, less fragile, if you have a system. If you assume your region or country is a closed system, and you create capabilities for your entire region to sustain itself without help from anyone, that would certainly make things more resilient. But it's something really kind of expensive and hard to do. So yeah, I mean, I hope that serves as an answer. I'm not an expert on this, so if you have any comments, let me know.
No, I think what, at least from my point of view, what the best thing that we can do is really not to cut ties with everyone. I think it is good to keep ties with everyone, but to be prepared for the ties to be cut at any point of time. So just to maybe have enough reserves, or just have in our possible scenarios that maybe at some point the ties will be cut, and so we need other alternatives so that we can survive for some point, for some amount of time, until ties get back, or until we find other solutions. So it is maybe keep dealing with everyone, but be prepared for a time where we can't deal with everyone. But I don't know how to.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's kind of similar to my reasoning, yeah, and similar to the reasoning behind things like resilient hubs, you know, cities or regions that are able to produce all the resources they need to sustain themselves by themselves. That's also the reasoning behind having refugees, you know, whether island refugees or underground refugees to survive extreme existential risks. If you have someone who's completely independent, then that makes the overall system of humanity more resilient. So yeah, that's absolutely right.
Okay, thank you very much. So to move on to another topic, someone asked, are there any key nutritional targets that are particularly hard to make resilient?
Fantastic question. We have been studying recently all macronutrients and micronutrients and ways to produce each of them. Together with Alex, I've looked into this quite a lot. And in our integrated scenario analysis, it looks like, depending on how things play, you know, depending on whether some food solutions work well or not, you could get troubles with protein or with fat, both of which are very important contributions to the diet. But that really depends on, you know, you'd have to have a couple of protein-based solutions fail for that to be a huge problem, or a couple of fat solutions to fail for that to be a problem. So just to give you an example, if you were to have a failure in crop relocation, imagine a very extreme scenario such as nuclear winter, and then you have a failure on crop relocation, then you'd have a trouble getting enough fat. It will be terrible for nutrition in general. You know, you get a lot less calories, a lot less protein, a lot less fat, but then you lose your main source of fat. So that will be a trouble. So again, it depends on how the thing plays out. So fats have been hard to deal with, but if crops can be relocated effectively, then the problem is not really that important. It's not really that big, you know, if you get that to work. Now, in terms of micronutrients, one obvious one is vitamin D in the abrupt sunlight reduction scenarios, because literally every walking or living being on Earth gets their vitamin D from sunlight. So if you suddenly lose a lot of it, you're going to produce a lot less, and whatever you're eating is also going to produce a lot less. So that's going to be a deficiency. Thankfully, it doesn't seem like it's a very severe one. People all around the world live with vitamin D deficiency, getting only mild and in some very rare cases, severe responses to it. But it looks like it's workable. And then there are a few other vitamins that are kind of a similar story, could be hard to get depending on which food sources would work out in this scenario. I hope that answers the question.
Super interesting. The next one is about price. How many of the resilient feeding strategies explored today have a chance to be price competitive in current food markets?
Yeah, I really like this question. I'm very interested on it because I'm very interested in the future of food in general, not just in a catastrophe. So price in the business as usual scenario is also is what matters here. So some of these things, some of the resilient foods we have studied are very unlikely to work economically in the business as usual scenario, but a lot of them, probably most, are, and a few of them are already, you know, working. So let me just give an example of each. Seaweed is being cultivated all around the world, and it's growing very fast as a market. So that one works economically, it's clear. Then there are others, such as, say, the single-cell protein works fine, more or less. You may have eaten corn, which is single-cell protein from sugar. Now, single-cell proteins from CO2 are getting a lot of investment, so that at least some investors think it is viable, and it's going to become an important ingredient or food in the coming future. And then I'll give you an example of one that wouldn't work. For example, I have studied how to leverage the potential of converting hydrocarbons, such as petroleum-derived or coal-derived feedstocks, to foods such as synthetic fat or butter substitutes or cooking oils and so on. That's one thing that people did historically because they were lacking fat because of trade reasons, but I don't really see that working at any point in the world today because we have a much cheaper and simpler way to produce them, which is oil crops. So that's one thing that wouldn't work. That it's hard to see that happening, but there are startups today looking to produce some specific fatty compounds synthetically, such as essential fatty acids and other, maybe more for supplements, and others that are looking to convert CO2 to fats. So I may be wrong, but I think that's one where the example is more or less, yeah, I don't really, it's hard to see that working price-wise.
Okay, great. This is the last one. How does food resilience programs links to the space exploration programs? Is that a way to fund such research? I'm sure you're gonna like this one, Juan.
Oh yeah, that's a beautiful question for me. I've been at the intersection of these two things, food systems resilience and space exploration. So I've done research on how to apply the single-cell protein process for closed loop food production systems in space or on refugees against existential risk. So yes, in a way, we have already co-opted funding for these dedicated to this in order to increase food resilience on Earth, because we've got some NASA grants to work on this topic, in closed loop food production systems such as the single-cell protein. That and from those grants, we have done research on how effective or efficient they are. Some food sources are for space, while at the same time studying how efficient they are to be used on Earth in a catastrophe. So that is kind of one way to fund it. At some point, we did think maybe some of the people who are really interested in funding space food research would be also interested on the uses on Earth. So that's potentially a workable fundraising strategy to prepare against catastrophes. So and just to complete the answer, so the foods we've studied for both situations, catastrophe and space, are the single-cell are the ones that are basically start with CO2 as a main feedstock, such as the single-cell protein, no biological synthesis of carbohydrates, such as sugars or glycerol, and microbial electrosynthesis from CO2.
Okay, one more question popped up. So it's from a science point of view, what is main unknown that remains to be answered to build resilient food system? So maybe I could reformulate by saying which scientific areas would be worth looking into to have better food systems that are more resilient.
That's a very broad question. There are many ways to go about answering it. So
what is the main unknown? Okay, the question is, what is the main unknown that remains to be answered to build resilient food systems? So that it was edited because it was not clear.
So let's approach it from different angles then. From the technical point of view, there does not seem to be an impediment to responding to even the worst catastrophes. So the solutions we have seem technically good enough to work out. Say if everyone or if a lot of people decided to make things go well, there's technologies and simple methods, you know, such as relocating crops and seaweed and so on, combined, seem good enough to prevent the worst from happening. So let's look at it outside of a technical lens and think about the cooperation angle and international relations. That's a very important unknown, because given how things are right now, it looks like cooperation is fundamental to get a best outcome should a catastrophe happen. So that's probably what I would call the main unknown. Like, is our cooperation good enough to get the best outcome should a catastrophe happen? So I guess research into institutional decision making would be useful for that. And then on the technical side, there remain some lesser unknowns, such as, would we be able to scale this or that food quickly, effectively enough? Could supply chains cope with it? And that's some of the research I'm looking forward to do in the coming years, I would say. And I'd be excited if other people in other research institutes, think tanks, departments, and so on were to work on as well. That type of supply chain, fast scale up, production ramp up analysis. And I hope that's good enough as an answer.
So there's one more that popped up, and Diego, let me read that one. Okay, so I think it's related. Do they assume a good water supply? What happens if the water is severely contaminated?
Right. So this
it's not really related.
This is outside of my area of expertise again, but I seem to remember that water contamination is not a very big issue outside of the affected areas. So I think you're thinking about the nuclear winter, or the nuclear war rather, scenario. In that case, it looks like there will be water contamination in the affected areas. I seem to remember it wouldn't be as bad as Chernobyl after the catastrophe, so to speak. Even if the nuclear bomb explodes, I'm not sure, but you know, as long as once you start getting away from the place where there's been a nuclear detonation, water isn't very effective, as far as I know.
Yeah, to add a bit upon that, we also looked a bit into that, and it's unclear whether radioactive fallout is actually really bad in like contaminating water and food. And there's also some research that shows that actually a really small amount of radioactive fallout is good for your health, because it stimulates your immune system and your regeneration. So depending on where you are, it can actually boost your health. Maybe.
Yeah, but that's really, really uncertain. It's
surprisingly the research is really,
yeah, the effects of fallout are not as well known as you would think, actually.
Yeah, we don't really know. Okay, yeah, Diego.
So maybe it's just that I missed part of the count, but you seem to often have the assumption that the industrial system is still functioning after a catastrophe. What would happen if it's not? And I guess in that scenario, civilians would have a much more important role. So in this scenario, what could we do ourselves if that's a part of the solution?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for answering the question. This is one that I also really like. Could you repeat? I missed the part you said something would be very important in this scenario. What was that?
So yeah, there were two questions. The first one is what happened in this scenario, and the second is the impact that civilians have. So I mean the individual I don't know behaviors and or
yeah
or I don't know mindsets or I don't know would have a large impact.
Okay, so yeah, I got both questions.
Okay.
So let me answer the first one. What happens if industry isn't quite there after a catastrophe? There, as you need to think about, like, the way we're approaching this question is by studying, in a way, limiting cases. So we're studying extreme scenarios with industry, but we've also studied extreme scenarios without industry, and then there are mechanisms for both of them to happen. There are mechanisms for having a catastrophe happen and then industry is unaffected, and others for having a catastrophe happen that also that affects both the food systems and the industry. So we've studied both scenarios. In reality, you really cannot predict what will happen, so you kind of have to be prepared for everything. And so if you imagine, I'll give you an example. So imagine an absolute worst case scenario in which you get a nuclear war that causes nuclear winter, and at the same time, the nuclear war has had nuclear EMP detonations that destroy industrial and electrical infrastructure. Well, in that case, you need to go into your response resilient food portfolio and see what's there that could help you get through that. So in that, if you assume the absolute worst case, all industry disabled from the nuclear detonations, then you cannot really trust, you can really put your trust on single cell protein, right? Because it's a high-tech solution that requires a lot of industrial infrastructure to be there. But there are things on the portfolio that you should be able to apply. You can still get the seaweed. It will be hard to relocate crops, but there are still ways you can do it. You could do a bunch of other stuff I haven't mentioned, such as grow cellulose digesting insects. You could basically, maybe you'd be even in a situation where you could grow potatoes. There are quite a few resilient foods that will work even in the worst cases where you have neither industry nor sunlight or other catastrophic scenarios. That's why it's important to have a very broad, wide portfolio of things that will work in several cases. That's what makes you resilient, right? You're prepared for whatever happens, even if you don't really know what the catastrophe is going to look like. In reality, things are always complicated, and there could always be a mixture of, oh, you lose some industry in this region, you lose most of the sunlight in this region, but then in this other region, you still have industry but no sunlight. In this other, you have, or in this case, rather than region, or in this case, yeah. So it's always a combination, right? It's always the answer to the question, to what degree do we lose each of these things? And we kind of address the question by looking at limiting cases. And the case where you lose both industry and sunlight looks really bad, but we've also done research that suggests even in that scenario, there are food solutions that you could apply such that you'd still be able to produce very significant amounts of food and save very significant amount of life. So that's the first question you answered.
Yeah.
Your question you asked. Now, the second one was about individual responsibilities, and how yeah. So the most I would say, in my opinion, the most important thing, should a very extreme food catastrophe happen for the general public, is not to panic. Because panicking, hoarding, and generally doing negative sum actions that don't help solve the situation, that would be problematic. So if people were to not panic, that would be extremely useful for an effective response to happen. So that's the number one thing.
People will hoard, right?
Sorry?
People will hoard. Or I mean, at some point,
It's to be expected, yes.
Rush for the toilet paper for no reason whatsoever.
Well, perhaps related to that,
Yeah.
is price gouging, would price gouging be bad in that scenario? Or would it actually be a useful tool to prevent people from acquiring more food reserves than they actually need or we can support?
Nah, because what matters is what you have at the start. It matters how much food you have at the start. So if people were to, if the public were to have their own, like some people did in the past, reserves with, I don't know, a lot of long-term duration food, canned food, whatever, before something like this happens, that would be really useful to have at the start. But once you have the abrupt loss of food production, or the abrupt food production shock rather happening, then after that, price gouging doesn't really help with anything, because you just have what you have after it has happened. It can be useful for people to slowly build up resistance, resilience to something like this before it happens. But after it happens, I don't see any way in which price gouging or hoarding could be useful at all.
By price gouging, I mean that the price of goods would basically, instead of trying to ration food by just saying everybody gets X amount of food, you just let the market take care of the price, and then naturally, because for example, you see this after disasters like hurricanes, people, it might be hard to get gas. A lot of people want to stock up on gas after hurricanes or stuff, or when they see that one is coming. So one way of doing this is to ration out gas and control the price arbitrarily. Another one is to sort of let the price rise, and then that brings in more supply, and maybe encourages people to use less gas and to avoid trying to hoard food for themselves, because the price is very expensive if they try to do that.
I think the problem with this
Right.
is that it takes lots of time to get to equilibrium. Time is of the essence.
And once again, the poor population gets hit first.
So, okay, this touches upon many things. I'm not an economist, but I'll answer as best as I can. So there's two questions to be here. One is about demand elasticity. The other one is about government intervention. So demand, or rather production of food, is somewhat inelastic with demand. So having the price go very high only doesn't really get you that much more food. So in that case, increasing the price wouldn't improve production that much at the beginning. If you can respond to that, that's a different question. But then the other thing about intervention of price controlling by the government or whatever institution, or even the question of rationing, that's a different thing. So if governments were to establish rationing, in a rational way, and at the same time respond with enough food production, that could be useful if they do it right. It's very hard to get right, but but yes, that could help. So that's in a way, and that's kind of one step further than controlling the price, but it's kind of the same reasoning. So yeah, controlling the price would work kind of in a similar way. Like, it could also be used as a tool, to prevent people from hoarding, and help a better response that saves the most lives. Yeah.
Sorry, I did not understand the last one. You said that raising the price will prevent people from hoarding.
I thought that's what you were saying, right? If the government controls the price of the foods, that could prevent people from unnecessarily hoarding.
Well,
again, I'm not an economist.
I don't know. I was not the one who asked the question, but if you rationalize the food, everybody gets the same treatment. I guess you decrease the risk of hoarding. But if you increase the prices so people cannot afford, then you will increase the risk of hoarding, because people that cannot afford will just go in the store.
Oh no, sorry. I said that it was the other way around, right? If government controls the price and keeps it in a reasonable level, then that helps people get what they need.
I think also there is also this danger with controlling the prices, is that the danger of the society collapsing would be very important. Like, I had also a question about this, because if we have people who are not very well informed, who are not, for example, very well prepared for these things, I think the best scenario would be that each person knows how to make his own food in general, in some way, because in general we feel what we don't know, and I think that people, at least in the COVID situation, behaved that way because they feared a very uncertain future, and they just in general, when faced with uncertainty, we will save ourselves first, and then people will know, and then we will go to the people that we know. Yes. So there is also this problem that maybe there will be, if the society collapses, then really we lose everything. And I mean, when I say by collapsing, I mean that the people will just lose faith in their government, so it will be just like a forest. Everyone is for himself. I don't know which other person.
Yeah, if something as bad as that were to happen, it's hard to talk about an effective response, right? If you get to such a bad scenario, I mean, there are still resilient food solutions at the community level that you could apply, but then it's hard to talk about an effective response if the thing has already got that bad. You have to be resilient to that happening.
So would one way that we can contribute is by knowing those solutions at the community level, or what is the best we can do in such scenarios with no industry and potentially no efficient state? Most expensive.
Yeah. So if you were to have a cooperation breakdown to the community level, it would be good to know in advance, naturally, which means of food production are available. Again, it would depend on the scenario. Whether there's been an industrial collapse or a sunlight reduction or both or a different thing, that changes the answer a lot. But it would be good to generally know which foods, just to give you an example, you can get leaf protein concentrate with relatively low-tech equipment, and that would still work no matter what the scenario is, because there would be leafy biomass around that you can extract the proteins and nutrients from. That's what we call a decentralized solution. So decentralized solutions are good because they work even in those most extreme cases. And so there are some of the resilient foods are to some degree decentralized. Then again, if you imagine our cooperation breakdown to the community level, and you've lost industry at the same time, you still have as much sunlight, and it would be good to know to cultivate the fields. It would be good to know how to poach and live from the forest by yourself, but that's kind of a, yeah. Generally, the complete cooperation breakdown scenarios are hard to think about. I'm not really much of an expert on that, but it's always good to know which solutions are available, and which foods are resilient to extreme risks.
Okay. Okay.
We can have one more, yes.
It will be the last one. So in general, we are talking this topic, I think, is really related to risk analysis, but there is this notion in risk analysis of the known unknowns and also the other notion of the unknown unknowns. Basically, I think here we were talking about the known unknowns, the things that we don't know will necessarily will happen, but at least we imagine them. But how about the things that we don't even imagine? Right? I might add also that, for example, in catastrophes, the problem with them is that we only imagine catastrophes based on past catastrophes. But I think that nature has always this way of like surprising us by new catastrophes. So how can we deal with things that we have never seen before and that we don't even imagine?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question.
Biggest last question.
Unknown unknowns are a really interesting topic, and by default extremely hard to prepare against, because you don't know what you need to be prepared against. So the only thing I can really say is you just need to generally be resilient. You need to build general resilience into the system as much as you can. You need to foster things like cooperation at all levels. You need to foster things like knowledge of what food production methods exist, just specifically for the food catastrophes, because you may not be prepared for something may happen that you weren't prepared for. But if you are aware of the resilient food or the portfolio of food options that you have, some of those may still work, even if something happened that you have not predicted at all. So if you know, if you have a good portfolio with fast scaling, easily rampable food solutions, you may still be able to use those, even if you couldn't predict at all what the catastrophe was going to be. So that's kind of what resilience is in a way. So you can have preparedness against very specific risks, but building general resilience is very useful no matter what, and it also helps you with the unknown catastrophic scenarios. That's all I have to say.
Sorry, but on the same topic, do you think for global catastrophic risk, it's probable to have unknown unknowns? Because we have, like, as human beings, we have a good understanding of our physical systems. We know what could hit Earth, what could bring us to die, lack of nutrition, nutrients, water, etc., etc. Could we expect actual unknown unknowns that could be really out of our reach? Out of our imagination, yes.
I didn't catch that last word.
Out of our imagination. Or
yeah.
out of things that we already thought about or already discovered. Because, okay, if you think about what would happen 200 years ago, there were many things that we haven't had discovered yet. Now we've a great distance between 200 years ago, and it seems like there's less and less things out of our reach. And so for only food-related problems, that's what I'm saying, are global catastrophic related to food, how possible it seems to have like unknown unknowns.
Well, I believe it's very likely.
Yeah.
So there's always, you could always get a black swan. You could always get something you thought was like physically or logically impossible happening or unexpected, and then that happens. You could always have something that you couldn't even imagine. I mean, humanity is progressing very fast in some direction, and we don't really know what's expecting us. So we may get something that we haven't even thought about at all right now. And there's people working on approaches with methodologies such as systems thinking and complexity science looking into this. I think the short answer is yes. Yes, I do believe you can get unknown unknowns, and there can always be extreme risks that you hadn't even thought about at all. No matter how much we have lived as a species or society so far, there's always something that can come and surprise you.
Wasn't the question more about an estimation of the scale? Like, if the more we know about a subject, I think the less likely are known unknowns. And so
that's right. That's right. My point was more, you can't really get rid of them, or you cannot assume at any point that you've got rid of all of them. Yeah. You always have to assume that they're there, because they might as well be. You don't know.
You can assume, but you'll be surprised.
Well, if you assume that there are unknown unknowns, and then an unknown unknown takes place, you'll be surprised by it, but you wouldn't be surprised that something unknown has taken place that you haven't predicted, right? Because you expect.
Yes,
it. That makes sense.
But the solution in itself doesn't change, right? It's an unknown unknown.
Oh, well, it could be the case that a solution that you haven't thought about is the best for that unknown case. So that would be the unknown unknown within the solution space, so to speak. Yeah, I think that's what you were talking about.
I think there was also this idea, like in the Black Swan by Nassim Taleb, the book, that basically we have some catastrophes that repeat themselves. And for Nicholas Nassim Taleb, basically he sees catastrophes as black swans, and basically black swans are very rare events that once they happen, they change the course of history. So basically, he says that basically why we have these black swans is because, like, once we have, for example, a new black swan, then we are 100% focused on that black swan. Like, for example, after the 2008 crisis, we were focused on the crisis. After COVID, we are now focused on viruses and these things. But at some point, we will start forgetting them, and maybe after, I don't know, some years, then we will forget about them. We'll say, for example, it will never happen again, because we survived it, and then because we start saying it will never happen again, maybe it will happen again.
That's true, but that's why I asked about the food unknown unknowns, because there are probably some unknown unknowns that with the crisis that we will have that might be completely unrelated to food. Like, the question is whether we have unknown unknowns on the food crisis, or if it's so deeply studied, because some people have their nose on it. They work a lot on this, that we look at food unknown unknowns or food known unknowns for a food crisis, but at the end, the actual crisis will come from somewhere else, because we focused on food. And that's what you said earlier, and that made me think about this is for the water, because you said, like, we consider that water is not much of an issue because even nuclear winter will not spoil the water for so long, or for on the global scale. But if actually we have an unknown unknown on water, so we don't study water sufficiently, and we actually end up having some virus that touched the whole water on Earth, then all the solutions you have on crops and everything, it just died, because water is the main ingredient.
There is a small problem with this, I think. But if all water is contaminated, then we all die.
Yeah, exactly. That's the point. So we need,
you don't need water.
Well, you could still purify it, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe some people could survive. I mean, you know, that's why you have to study many things, right? You have to look at things from many different angles. You have to also look at the water problem. I mean, we've looked into the fact that the research we've read makes us think water supply wouldn't be a huge problem in a rapid sunlight reduction scenario. Does not mean it wouldn't be a huge problem in an industrial collapse scenario. And that's something I'm doing research myself on. How do we actually get water for people in that situation when water pumping stations are down and things like that? But basically, you just have to look into more of the things that could happen and more into how and more solutions for them, and more research is needed, just in general. That's always the conclusion, right, with researchers. That's what always the answer. The more you can reduce your uncertainty, the more you can reduce your uncertainty, the better. But there will always be some uncertainty remaining. But we need to reduce uncertainty a lot more.
I think like just one last idea. Like I think also the research is on this risk threatening on this like risk that threaten life on a big scale. Like the problem is that like I think like we need somehow to assume that the catastrophe that will happen like will leave some chance for us to survive, or at least for a proportion of humanity to survive. Because like if the catastrophe that is happening like will with 100% like certainty like it will wipe out everyone, then we can just then we can't do like anything about it. So I think like when we do research about these things, we need to assume somehow that at least that there is a small chance for a proportion of humanity to survive.
Well, some X-risk is focused just on prevention. Like it was at the beginning of the presentation, we saw like the 3 different layers of defense. And so for some risks, you can only do prevention. And I guess the thing with food is that like, since so many scenarios have more than just prevention, it's the part after that's sort of neglected. And by definition, you're sort of only looking at the things where you've survived and you have to not die after surviving the first, big problem.
Yeah. There's some chance that some risks just don't allow for response. It's not impossible. And in that case, all you can do is prevention. That's right.
Okay, let's wrap up.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Juan, for taking the time taking the time to present your research and what ALLFED is doing. I'm sending a link for feedback if you and the other attendants want to send us feedback. Also send it in a Signal group later. That was super interesting, and yeah.
Thank you so much for coming, and thank you for the super interesting discussion, everyone.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And we will surely re-invite you when we have other topics to give you for the EAL Lausanne, or also more people to join. Thank you very much for being the first one to do the conference with EAL Lausanne. So you start this conference cycle with really, really interesting topics. And hopefully we'll hear more of this.
Fantastic. All right, have a great day, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.